Spaced repetition software is designed to delay reviews as long as possible without letting you forget. For learning Chinese though, barely remembering something is not enough. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about spaced repetition software, or SRS for short, and one of its most significant shortcomings. SRS can be very efficient for remembering Chinese characters and words, and with only a little time you can maintain a large vocabulary in Chinese. While I think this is true, it also hides a potential problem, namely that the kind of knowledge you get from using spaced repetition software is not actually the kind of knowledge you need to be able to use Chinese. And this is what we're going to talk about in this episode. Before we get to that though, I have two announcements to make. First, there is a Chinese listening challenge on for June. It's completely free to join, and the goal is simply to listen more than you normally do by focusing on listening for 3 weeks. To learn more about the challenge, including what you should listen to and how, check out challenges.hackingchinese.com or the link in the show notes. If you're listening to this after the listening challenge is over, you can still head over to the challenges page to see what challenge is on when you are listening. Second, and on a related note, I've opened my listening course for enrollment again, and it's called The Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water. And you can learn more about my courses at hackingchinese.com/courses. Okay, so let's get back to the topic of this episode, which is spaced repetition software. As mentioned, it is a truly efficient way to remember Chinese characters and words, and if you haven't tried it out, I think you should. Just to be clear, spaced repetition software refers to any computer program or app where you have flashcards of some type and that these cards are scheduled out over time depending on how you answer the flashcards. If you answer correctly, the interval to the next review will be increased, but if you answer incorrectly, the interval will be reset or at least greatly reduced. This is great because it allows you to focus on the vocabulary you really need to review, and the things you know already will be scheduled very far into the future eventually. Most serious apps that have some kind of a vocabulary component these days have spaced repetition built in, even if it's not necessarily mentioned on the cover. If you haven't tried spaced repetition at all, I strongly suggest that you do. It is very efficient and a great way to remember certain things. To learn more about SRS, I suggest you tune into episode 290, Spaced Repetition Software, what it is and how to use it to learn Chinese. In this episode though, I want to talk about a problem with spaced repetition software. This problem is related to the scheduling itself and the whole reason why spaced repetition is so efficient. So one of the key principles that make SRS work is that reviews that are difficult have a bigger impact on your ability to remember something than reviews that are easy. So let's take a handwriting flashcard as an example. So you might have the meaning in English and perhaps the pinyin on the front, and you're supposed to write the Chinese character as the answer. If we're looking at only one individual review, the difficulty of this review determines how much your memory of this character gets strengthened. This is partly why massing your repetitions together is a bad idea. So if you write this character 10 times in a row, based on this flashcard then, this won't really help your long-term retention that much, but if you spread the reviews out over time, it will be much better. And the reason for this then is that if you delay your next review by a few days, you will have to think hard before you come up with how to write this character. And then when you wait a few days extra next time, you will have to think hard again. And then after 2 weeks, you need to think extra hard to remember how to write this. So you can see that these reviews are difficult because the interval grows longer, so reviewing never really becomes easy, assuming that this is the only way you review this character. So this is a good thing. This is why we can have longer and longer intervals and spend less and less time on the words we already know. But it's also one of the major shortcomings of spaced repetition software, because when we're talking about language learning specifically, just barely being able to recall something after trying very hard is not enough. This will be easier to appreciate if we compare with other knowledge types. So let's say you wanted to memorize the capitals of all the countries in the world. Or perhaps you're in medical school and want to memorize a lot of terminology. In these cases, spaced repetition software can be awesome because it allows you to recall all these things while spending a minimum amount of time. If somebody asks you what the capital of Nepal is, it's okay to think a few seconds before you say Kathmandu. Similarly, there are many things that doctors don't need to know instantly, because perhaps it's not something they work with right now, but it's still useful to be able to recall this information, not just on a test, but also when working. Again, it's fine to have to think a bit before you recall the name of a medicine you normally don't have need for, or perhaps recalling a name in Latin you haven't seen since you went to school. The point I want to make in this episode, though, is that using a language is not like any of these cases, because delaying and just barely being able to recall something after thinking for a few seconds just isn't enough. When you listen, you need to deal with several words per second, and also how these words are structured, what they're supposed to mean in context, and so on. When you speak Chinese, you can't really stop 5 seconds between each word to try to figure out which word it is and how to say it, because then a conversation will be practically impossible. Reading and writing are not as sensitive because you can take the time you want, assuming there is no test. But if you read very slowly, sometimes this can be the same as not being able to read simply because it takes too much time. The point here is that it seems like the main benefit of spaced repetition is also a major disadvantage. The goal of the algorithm is to push the review out as far as possible while still allowing you to remember the word. And this next review then is meant to be hard and take time. Naturally, you could achieve more speed and automaticity by using flashcards as well. For example, if you just increase the number of reviews, you would get faster, and if you're very strict when you grade yourself, so you only mark yourself as correct if you recall the word both correctly and quickly. Still, this seems to go against the whole idea of the increasing intervals in spaced repetition algorithms, and doing so seems to negate the main upside of using SRS in the first place. So, what to do? Well, since I still use spaced repetition software myself, my proposed solution is not to delete your flashcard app. So here are some reasons why I think SRS can still be useful. First, slow recall is better than no recall. While it's true that slow recall is often not enough, remembering something is still better than not remembering it at all. This is particularly important for input, so listening and reading, because if you know the basic meaning of words, even if it takes you time to recall many of them, this will allow you to read and listen to more Chinese without looking things up. Naturally, this is harder in the case of listening, because you might need to listen many times before you even hear the word and can connect it to its meaning, but it's much better that the knowledge is there in your brain, even if it's hard to get at, rather than in a dictionary. For reading, the case is even stronger, because usually reading slower and understanding what you're reading is perfectly fine. So the core idea here is that SRS can be a stepping stone to more comprehensible input, and that in itself will then improve familiarity, fluency, speed, automaticity, and all these nice things we want. Second, speed is not always necessary. The example I gave earlier, where you had to think for 5 seconds before coming up with each word when you speak Chinese, is of course true, but somewhat unrealistic. Yes, if you think exactly 5 seconds for every word you want to say, listening to you will be a pain, but if you stop and think for a few seconds for some words in some sentences, this is not really a problem. If you only ever encounter Chinese words in a flashcard app rather than when listening, speaking, reading, and writing, then this would be a problem, but the more you use the language, the quicker you will be at the things that recur often and the things that really matter, and so taking some time for the rarer words is sometimes not a problem at all. Again, this is particularly true for reading and writing, where you control the pacing much more, and you can spend more time recalling a hard word and then speed up when you encounter easier words. Third, superficial recall is better than no recall. Another problem with SRS is that you should only put a limited amount of information on a flashcard. You should ask about how is this written, what does this character mean, etc. Not all of these things at once. It's also exceedingly hard to test or check things like usage, nuances, and so on. Still, being able to recall the basic meaning is often enough, and again, the end goal is not to be good at spaced repetition software and clear all your reviews, it is to listen, speak, read, and write. It's also through input that you learn the nuances and difference between words and how they function in context and so on. So you're not really meant to learn these things through spaced repetition software, it's just a way to access more comprehensible input. The fourth and final reason I think SRS is still useful is that deep knowledge is not always a requirement. Now, this might sound the same as the third reason I brought up, but this is different in the sense that sometimes the end goal isn't necessarily to master a word fully. There will always be many words on the periphery of what we know that we might want to know superficially, but don't really need to master right now. For example, I know many bird names in several languages, including English, Swedish, and Chinese, and I can probably translate text with these words accurately, but that doesn't mean I know much about these words or these birds. I just know that it is a bird, and sometimes this is actually enough. Most people don't need to know everything about the birds, it's just enough to know that it is a bird, or maybe even an animal. This is important in the context of this episode because sometimes this kind of superficial knowledge is actually the end goal. You don't need to know everything about everything, and SRS is exceedingly good at maintaining this peripheral vocabulary. So this is why I use spaced repetition software, and also why I think you should too. As I've said several times already, the main point is to use the language, and this means mostly listening and reading, and this is where the real knowledge comes from, and SRS is just a stepping stone. The real problem is using spaced repetition too much, or mostly seeing words through flashcards rather than through listening and reading. When you listen and read, you will be naturally exposed to the most common words most often, because this is what common means. This means that if you listen and read a lot, you will get really fast at the most common words. If we take reading as an example, you will get really fast at recognizing the 5 most common characters, de, I, bu, shi, and le. Compare these with the 5 least common characters among the 2,500 most common characters. Sang, throat or voice, dun, to squat, fen, to burn or to set fire to, tao, to wash or to rinse, and nun, tender. On average, you are 500 times more likely to see the former set compared to the latter. As you can see, this perfectly balances the shortcoming of spaced repetition software. The problem there is that the really common characters get kicked out very far into the future, so you hardly see them at all, and you never build this speed. But if you read enough, you will see the most common characters over and over, and so those are also the ones that you will be able to process fastest. And then, if it takes you a little bit extra time to process the character nun, tender, then that is not a problem. So to summarize, spaced repetition software can be extremely useful for learning and remembering words in Mandarin, but it also has some serious shortcomings. However, listening and reading to Chinese perfectly counters these shortcomings, and the solution then is to do both. You should spend most of your time listening to and reading Chinese you can mostly make sense of, and then you can add spaced repetition software on top of this. Preferably, you don't use high-quality study time to go through your flashcards, but instead find small pockets throughout the day where it would be inconvenient to do anything else. For example, if you're queuing in a grocery store, it's a little bit inconvenient to pull up a book and start reading, but you can perfectly well deal with a few flashcards. If you do this consistently throughout the day and build good habits, you can deal with most of your flashcards in pockets of time you couldn't really use for anything else. You can then invest the rest of your study time into listening, reading, and communicating with others. And by doing so, you also avoid most of the potential problems with spaced repetition software. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.